Why do you keep falling for the same person, wearing a different face? There is a term for this. Psychologists call it repetition compulsion, an unconscious drive to recreate familiar emotional dynamics, even when those dynamics caused you real harm. It's not a flaw, it's a pattern. Modern psychology and neuroscience confirm that most of what drives human behavior operates beneath conscious awareness. The choices that feel most spontaneous, especially in love, are often the most deeply scripted by your past. Your nervous system was calibrated early. Before language, before memory you can access, your brain was learning what closeness feels like, what safety sounds like, and what love is supposed to cost you emotionally. Behavioral scientists study how the emotional environment you grew up in shapes decisions you make decades later. The brain builds a template, a blueprint. Then it quietly uses that blueprint to screen every new person you meet. Here's the disorienting truth. Familiarity and compatibility aren't the same thing, but they feel identical inside your nervous system. What feels like chemistry is often just recognition, the brain saying, "I've been here before." This is where the pattern becomes genuinely hard to untangle. If your early caregivers were inconsistent, critical, or emotionally unavailable, your nervous system learned to associate love with anxiety. And anxiety, over time, starts to feel like aliveness. Behavioral science reveals something counterintuitive. Humans often prefer a painful outcome they can predict over an uncertain outcome that might be better. The familiar ache of a difficult relationship can feel safer than the open unknown of a healthy one. Freud named this in 1920. His insight was that people return to painful dynamics not out of masochism, but out of an unconscious hope. If I can make this work this time, I can finally resolve what I never could as a child. But the wound doesn't heal through repetition. It deepens. Each cycle reinforces the neural pathway, making the pattern feel more natural, more inevitable, until it stops feeling like a pattern at all, and just feels like who you are. Here's the question most people reach and then get stuck on. If you already know the pattern exists, why does it keep happening? Insight alone, it turns out, rarely rewires a deeply grooved neural habit. Neuroscience explains why. The brain processes social and emotional cues at extraordinary speed, well before conscious thought engages. By the time you decide you're attracted to someone, your nervous system has already run its pattern-matching algorithm. Here's the surprise. The sense of being a separate, stable self, making free choices, is itself assembled by the brain, moment by moment. Psychologist Scott Barry Kaufman, drawing on decades of cognitive science, describes this as the brain's ongoing act of self-construction. The you who thinks it's choosing freely is already downstream of processes it never sees. The Association for Contextual Behavioral Science, the ACBS, has built an entire research program around exactly these contextual factors. The tone of a voice, the particular way someone withholds warmth, the specific texture of being kept slightly off balance. These cues activate the old template faster than any conscious reasoning can intervene. Behavioral science also examines how incentives shape behavior. B.F. Skinner's research on variable ratio reinforcement schedules showed that rewards delivered unpredictably produce the most persistent behavior of all. Intermittent emotional reward, warmth that appears without warning, runs on exactly this mechanism. It's the same principle that makes gambling so hard to stop. There's a misconception worth naming directly. This pattern doesn't mean you're broken, weak, or self-destructive. It means your brain is doing exactly what brains do, using past data to predict and navigate the present. The problem is, the data is old. Attachment theory gives this mechanism a precise name. The emotional style you developed with early caregivers, secure, anxious, or avoidant, becomes the lens through which you read every subsequent intimate relationship, often without realizing the lens exists. If your attachment style is anxious, formed through caregivers who are inconsistent, you'll feel most activated by partners who are emotionally unpredictable. Not because you want pain, but because that activation pattern is what your nervous system reads as love. This is the insight that changes everything. The pattern isn't a character flaw. It's a map drawn in childhood, still running on outdated coordinates. Naming it, actually seeing it, is the first act of genuine interruption. The American Psychological Association's guidelines on insight-oriented therapy identify this moment of pattern recognition as a necessary precondition for behavioral change. Not sufficient. The ACBS World Conference has repeatedly highlighted research showing that structured changes to environment and choice architecture help people make decisions they recognize as better in the long run. The same principle applies internally. Acceptance and commitment therapy, one of the ACBS's flagship frameworks, teaches that you can deliberately redesign the psychological conditions under which your choices get made. But here's where it gets harder. Even when you see the pattern clearly, the pull toward familiar dysfunction doesn't simply vanish. Comfort and correctness are different things. Your nervous system will still reach for what it knows, even as your mind reaches for something better. Consider what this looks like in real life. You meet someone. Something about them feels electric, urgent, immediately significant. That intensity, that sense of "this is different," is often the exact signature of the old template activating, not evidence that this person is exceptional. The most useful reframe behavioral science offers here is this: intensity is not intimacy. The electric feeling of instant connection can be genuine, or it can be your nervous system recognizing a familiar emotional shape and labeling that recognition as chemistry. This is why slowing down isn't timidity, it's neuroscience. When you pause before acting on intense early attraction, you give your prefrontal cortex time to engage. You create a gap between the pattern firing and the choice being made. Structured self-examination, through therapy, through journaling, through practices that build what psychologists call reflective function, changes the neural conditions under which you make relational choices. It doesn't erase the pattern. It builds a new path beside it. This matters beyond romantic relationships. Research on workplace dynamics, including studies published through the APA on authority relationships and organizational behavior, shows the same unconscious template matching shapes how people respond to managers, mentors, and colleagues. The pattern isn't confined to love. It's the architecture of how you move through the entire social world. The Association for Contextual Behavioral Science was founded on exactly this premise: that seemingly arbitrary contextual factors shape human decisions and attitudes in ways people rarely notice. Your childhood home wasn't arbitrary. It was the most powerful context you ever inhabited. Its emotional weather became your internal climate. The cost of leaving this invisible is measurable. A 2019 study in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that individuals who couldn't identify their own relational patterns reported significantly lower relationship satisfaction across a 10-year period, not because their partners were worse, but because the unexamined pattern kept selecting for the same dynamics. Each repetition erodes your trust in your own judgment. The pattern doesn't stay neutral. Unexamined, it compounds. Remember that row of identical doors from the beginning? The pattern isn't the door. The pattern is the hand that keeps reaching for the same knob without pausing to ask why. That pause, that single moment of hesitation, is where change actually lives. The pattern isn't your fate. It's information about where your nervous system was trained. And information, unlike fate, can be worked with, specifically through the practice of reflective function, the capacity psychologists define as the ability to interpret your own and others' behavior in terms of underlying mental states. When you strengthen that capacity through therapy or deliberate journaling, you're not just gaining insight, you're building the neural infrastructure for a genuinely different choice. Here's something worth holding on to. Neuroscientists studying adult neuroplasticity have found that the brain retains the capacity to form new relational templates well into adulthood. The old pathways don't disappear, but new ones can become dominant through repeated corrective experience. One secure relationship, one consistent therapeutic alliance, one friendship where trust is genuinely reciprocal, can begin to compete with the old wiring. The self isn't fixed. It's always quietly under revision. Here's something you can do today. The next time someone feels immediately, urgently familiar, open a notebook and write down 3 specific emotional qualities they remind you of. Not their appearance, their emotional texture. Then ask, When did I first feel this way, and with whom? That trace is the pattern becoming visible. And a visible pattern is, for the first time, one you can actually choose differently.